Okay, thanks for showing up. Thank you, Peter, for the privilege of talking to the Tower Clock chapter folks. So we've got a little story today that involves observations. So when we get through, you can see if some of my observations agree with the evidence at hand. And it starts with the research that I've done over the years on the most interesting clockmakers in America, and those are from upstate New York. And as you're probably all familiar, most of the guys that ended up making clocks in upstate New York, the majority of whom operated between 1820 and 1840 or so, had roots in Connecticut. And it's usually very difficult to try to figure out what they were doing in Connecticut before they ended up in New York. And most of our concentration has been finding clocks with upstate New York labels, finding out who these people were in regards to upstate New York, where they lived, how long they made clocks, and to run around the countryside for 40 years looking for examples, because in many cases they're very scarce and rare because they all found it very difficult to carry skills earned in Connecticut up to New York and make any sort of living. So their typical tenures were very short-lived. The surviving clocks few. And when you're done, really you end up with the clocks and say, this is a clock by William Hickcox, and we don't know much about him, but thank goodness we have a few clocks left. In this case, through somewhat happenstance, I was able not only to document the New York work, but also find out what William was doing in Connecticut at the time. And in doing so, I came to the conclusion that I could, with some regularity, spot a William Hickcox clock from across a room, even though he made pillar and scrolls and half column and splat clocks like 100 other people did. So let's see if you agree. And of course, my research started in New York because that's where I found the clocks with his names on them. So I did the normal tracking. First recorded deed was in June 1834, when he and his wife, Maria Hemingway Hickox, purchased for $250, which went a long way back then, a 2-acre lot, part of lot number 15 in Freemasons or Bayard's patent, and we'll show where that was in a second, in the settlement of North Bridgewater, town of Bridgewater, New York, from a William Allen. Town of Bridgewater, located in the southeast corner of Oneida County. We'll see a map in a second. The deed referenced the fact that the property already contained a barn owned by Hickcox, so it implies that he was leasing the property prior to purchase and that it had already built a building on the property prior to 1834. The lot fronted on what is today Route 8, which is still a somewhat major thoroughfare that runs north to south from Pennsylvania up into Utica and then north into the southern Adirondacks. And it crisscrosses in the town of Bridgewater, Route 20 going east and west, the Cherry Valley Turnpike. So these were both routes that in the early 1800s were major thoroughfares for settlers and merchandise going north, south, east, and west. And in the deed was an interesting reference to the fact that the buildings and other improvements as part of the purchase of the lot were purchased in part from an inheritance of $1,000 from Maria's father, John Hemingway of New Haven, Connecticut. I don't know what that translates to into 2024 money, but I'm sure it would be very substantial. So here we have a map of Oneida County, New York here. And it's essentially about 2/3 of the way between Albany and Syracuse. And the town of Bridgewater is in the southeast corner. This is Route 20 going east and west. And this right here is what is now Route 8. There's lot 15 in Bayard's patent, which means Mr. Bayard bought this property at auction from the state of New York after they had swindled it out of the Oneida Nation. The Hickox homestead can be found by tracking the deeds. They sold this property in August 1836, so that's 2 years from the purchase of the property to the sale, to a William Allen of Clinton for $450. In 1837, he transferred it to Nicholas Rhodes, and Rhodes was the owner in 1852 when the first Oneida County map was published. These maps are tremendous research materials because they remarkably put the homesteads and the names of the owners on just about every map, and then the villages are blown up into larger maps, so most of the village residents are also noted. So this is Mr. Rhodes in 1852, and this is current day Route 8. Here's the farmstead. Here's what the house looks like now, and as I note, there may be an 1830 house under this Victorian facade. Who knows? In any case, that's the location, and you can see the countryside, the nice rolling hills, and nice flat, and it looks like good soil. So the clocks that he was making in New York, they're extremely scarce. After 40 years, I think maybe I found a dozen, but that may be an extravagant estimate. Of course, I bought most of the ones I found, and I think I have 6. So I may have seen 10 or so. They fall into 3 categories: short case, half column, and flat clocks. Nothing stylistically too extravagant. Transitional pillar and scrolls. These are quite interesting and really are the means for getting back into Connecticut and making and postulating about his case-making activities, and we'll describe those and show those in a second. And then the third type is a one-of-a-kind, one really large empire, upstate New York pillar and scroll that's only 44 inches tall, 19 inches wide, and 8.5 inches deep, and we'll see a picture of that. So not a large sample size by any means. Of course, the wood movement sources for these clocks is always something of interest. There were 2 makers in upstate New York that I can recall off the top of my head that made their own wood movements, and they were foolish to do so because that's a lot of time and effort, and it's not a factory production like the Connecticut people, and it's hard to imagine somebody fashioning, operating 5-wheel train, typical Terry-type wood movements in their barn at a cost that would be less than just buying it from the clock peddler coming up the pike. Hickcox was one of the smart ones that made his own cases but got his movements from Connecticut. And even so, his sources were unusual. He was the only upstate case maker in the 1820-1845 period that actually sourced Seth Thomas 30-hour movements. You would think others would have, but they didn't. Seth Thomas, one of the most prolific makers of wooden works clocks movements at that point. And the other, Garner Curtis, who was one of the most obscure or more obscure of the wooden works movement makers. And one might suggest from his movement sources that he had some relationship with them from his time in Connecticut, and we can speculate on that, I guess, in a spare moment or two. And why wood movements? Of course, I give this talk to people who don't know anything about wood movements, but these were the movements that you could put in a clock and still sell the clock cheaply enough so that your average fledgling farmer in upstate New York, right off the field of clearing 5 acres from trees, could afford. They certainly couldn't afford a brass movement clock in that period. So your clocks with wood movements were the only type of clocks that you could make affordably and then sell to a buyer and maybe make some money. But that might not have been even possible because at this point, consider the fact that, well, William Hickcox was making cases and selling clocks, as were several others in the area within 30 miles at the time. They were competing with Connecticut clock peddlers coming up the Cherry Valley Turnpike, selling clocks from Connecticut in bulk and probably underpricing their clocks compared to theirs. And that's why these guys only lasted a couple of years. So very competitive environment at the time. Again, we have probably folks in here that know a lot about wood movements. So I'll just show these, and if you were at Pat's talk earlier, you would immediately be able to tell that this is a Garner Curtis, not a Seth Thomas. I think there are very few differences actually between Garner Curtis movements and Seth Thomas. I think the arbors on the strike control arbors, the pivots are wood and steel instead of steel and steel, or steel and steel instead of the opposite, or whatever. Very few differences, and maybe some of the rings around the pivot holes. In any case, Garner Curtis, not a prolific maker, and the Snowden-Taylor ID on this one was 1.6, and it's probably got a few more digits by now. And then this is the Seth Thomas movement, and notice the pivots here are wood-wood. Other than that, not a lot of differences. And these are the two movements found in the shelf clocks that we're going to look at right now. Here are the labels. He used two labels. That implies that he made more than a couple clocks. Today, if you want to print books, well, today you can print a number of books you want. But 10 years ago, if you wanted to print books that say you got to print at least 500 or 100 or 200 to make any money. So let's say he printed 50 at a time or 100 at a time. That might give us an idea of how many clocks were made. This was his early label where he implies that Eli Terry had something to do with his clocks, but he didn't, and that was certainly common and probably a very smart thing to do. At Bridgewater, New York, William Hickcox, and then later on he dispensed with any charade that he might be dealing with Eli Terry and just said improved clocks manufactured and sold by William Hickcox. Both of these were printed by Maynard's Print, Utica, which was about 10, 12 miles north. Okay, so the three case styles, the short case, half column, and splat. They don't all look the same, but it's the same basic design. First case, mahogany veneered splat. These are pine half columns stained to look like mahogany. The case sides are not veneered. The secondary wood is cherry, which is not something you find on Connecticut clocks. So if you're carrying around clocks, moving clocks around your house, when you pick up one of these, you're surprised because they weigh as much as a giant clock because they made out of cherry, not pine. This one had a Seth Thomas movement and has the late label. Here's another one with a veneered splat, a little classier looking clock. And these cases, or a few of these, have very interesting columns. They're three-part columns. The caps and the bases are solid maple, and then they're attached with nails to the pine painted center sections of the columns. And I'm sure there are other makers who did this. I just couldn't remember any, and I haven't thought of any since. So that's sort of cool, and it adds an element of color and design to an otherwise basic cases. Of course, you do notice the dials too. Some of the dials appear to be Connecticut sourced, and we're going to see one or two that look like they were made locally. By the way, if you have any questions as we go along, just spout out. Your third case, I really like this clock. I really think it's got a lot of it's got some simplicity but class to it, and it's up in my bedroom. So I like looking at it every day. And I'm not sure why, but it's really, I really like this clock. Anyway, another half column and splat, the 3-part columns again. It's got a mushroom splat on it, not entirely like or dissimilar from the typical Silas Hoadley sort of mushroom splat, and remember that relationship because there might be something that's my forewarning, I guess. The dial on this one definitely looks like it's locally sourced. That does not in any way look like a Connecticut hand-painted dial, and no gesso at all on the dial. It's a really clean, very white, very pretty dial. This one has a Curtis movement with the late label. Transitional pillar and scroll cases. Those of you who appreciate the genre know that these show up. They're certainly not common. Stone and Taylor used to say, these are the real transitional clocks, not the carved clocks or whatever, or the half column and splats. That's a transitional clock because it's got part pillar and scroll and part half column and splat. So again, most of these I've seen over the years were Silas Hoadley clocks, and I know I've seen a few other ones. I don't think I've ever seen a Jerome in this combo, but anyway, those of you who might have these, you can correct me or not. But in any case, this is a William Hickcox transitional pillar and scroll case. Transitional in that it's got part pillar and scroll, which really is just the base, and otherwise it's a short case, half column and splat. Although I would note a couple things that will follow as we go along. One is the splat, and I'll talk more about that in a second, but there's something very interesting about his splats, but I'll hold on that. I will note the elongated upper sections of the half columns. Of course, these differ from maker to maker, but there weren't many that show up with these elongated patterns. And then the bottoms of the columns are flat turned, not multiple turned like you might see on most. And you might say, well, why does that make any difference? And I guess one would argue that maybe it doesn't, but I'm going to argue to the contrary.
What would the sides be?
Excuse?
What would the sides on that one be, the transitional?
Oh, I think, did I put it? There you go. 28 3/4 high, 17 1/8 wide, 4 1/2 deep. So it's a standard, pretty much standard half column and splat case with the additional 3-inch, say 3-inch base.
The sides veneered or not veneered?
Yes, the sides are veneered.
Veneered, okay.
Yep. Additional examples. These are all William Hickcoxes. This case has a late label and a Curtis movement. The dial appears locally sourced, and it does have gesso decorations on it. The upper column on this one is 5 inches in length. The upper column on this one is 5 1/2. They both have the flat turning on the base. And otherwise, they're basically the same cases.
Aren't there some Hoadley clocks that have those flat turnings? Sorry.
You're a smart boy, Patrick. All right, and last but not least, I mentioned this wonderful, I wish it was typical, but it's totally atypical. Empire pillar and scroll, 44 inches high, 7 different types of woods and veneers on this clock. It has the 3-piece columns, only these are full columns, but it's got the maple tops and bottoms, got the great tiger maple ball finials and the little urn at the top. This is a fantastic clock. It's got the locally done dial as well. It's got a late label. It's got a Garner Curtis 30-hour Woodworks movement, but clearly the case is deep enough to take an 8-day Woodworks movement, and maybe it was made for that, but he just didn't have one available. This is the only one of these known. As you know, those of you who saw Chris Brown's collection, this was in that collection at one point before it moved on. All right, so this is what I found by observing these clocks that struck me eventually as being really different. And I call it a tell, which in poker or sports is something like a pitcher always twitches his left eyeball before he throws a fastball, or he holds his hand a certain way before he throws a curveball. And you pick up on that, or a guy playing poker, his eyes start twitching or something when he has a good hand. That's called a tell. And I think Hickcox had a tell. These are the clocks we just looked at. And what on these clocks is unusual? You're supposed to answer.
Oh, I'm supposed to-
Come on. Anybody. The upturned ends of the splats. And you're going to say, oh, I've seen that before. Well, okay. Where have you seen it before? I looked through Chris Brown, the book I did with Chris on Good for a Time, which had almost 300 American-made wooden works clocks in it. And I found one clock out of all those clocks. Now, of course, Pillar and Scrolls do that. But on the shelf clocks with stenciled and veneer splats, I found one clock with that. And I'll show it to you in a second. So I had come to the conclusion that that was really cool, that all of those William Hickcox clocks that we just saw, the shelf clocks, had that feature, so I could pick out a William Hickcox from across the room. And then one day in 2017, I was looking at the American Clock and Watch Museum website, flipping through looking for something, I can't remember what, and this clock shows up. Upturned splat end, elongated upper column parts, flat lower column parts, transitional pillar and scroll, and I called up Tom Manning and said, of course on their website it didn't say who made the clock. I called up Tom Manning and said, check this clock, I really think that's a William Hickcox. But it's not a William Hickcox.
Yep.
Pat, what was it?
I got this one, Silas Hoadley.
Way to go.
Smart, huh?
Silas Hoadley, Plymouth, Connecticut. Typical, well, Hoadley label, of course, and a typical, Hoadley was a dial guy. I mean,
he was.
all his woodwork, his tall clock dials are great. And there was an article recently about the guy who painted them. Shelf clock dials, fantastic. Even his OG dials, if you've seen those, you can pick those out from across the room. It's really great. Anyway, here's the movement from it. It's the Terry type Hoadley, as described by the eminent researcher Pat Higgins this morning. Okay, so what's happening here? That's, again, in my mind, that is absolutely a William Hickcox case. So then I started seeing these clocks all over the place. This was in a Catone's auction in 2017. Upturned splat, elongated upper sections, flat lower section, transitional pillar and scroll. And a couple more in Connecticut. This one without a base, but all the same characteristics. Hoadley, another Hoadley. This one, no elongated upper sections, but the flat turning top and bottom, which you see a lot on
Hoadley too.
Hoadley cases.
You see him on both.
Other cases, other Hoadley cases.
Yes.
So now I'm starting to think maybe we have a relationship. With evidence suggesting a link between Hickox and Hoadley, I contacted Mary Jane Dapkus. Now, we all know that it's much easier to research these days because we have the internet and find a grave and census records out the whatever. But the most important way to do any research today and to do it conclusively is to call Mary Jane Dapkus, okay? So we all know that, and if you don't know it, now you know, so call her up. So I said, Mary Jane, you're in Connecticut, I'm not. Could you, when you wander through the census or the deed records in Watertown, Connecticut, and see what you can come up with. So the following comes from Mary Jane with very little work by me. So Our friend William was born in 1796, likely at Watertown, Litchfield County. His parents were somewhat difficult to identify. I went back through the census records to find out men who were old enough to be fathers in 1800. And with Hickcox last names, we got Amos, Amos Jr., James, James Jr., Daniel Jr., Caleb, Samuel, Randall, Jonas, and Consider. But evidence now suggests her parents were Randall and Submit Hickcox. There's a young girl's name that you probably wouldn't find many of today. So now we sort of know who his parents would be. Watertown, as with most towns in central Connecticut in the early 1800s, was full of clockmakers and clock suppliers. I mean, Plymouth is like 10, 12 miles away, major makers there, makers in Watertown, et cetera. And it clearly appears, based on solid evidence, that William Hickcox was absolutely making cases in Watertown before he went to New York. So in Bailey and Spittlers and Bailey's book, these were hopefully a fairly complete list of the clockmakers in Watertown in the period that Hickcox was there. Bishop and Bradley making pillar and scroll clocks primarily in the 1820s up to 1832. Bishop and Hemingway, both of these guys were businessmen, by the way. They weren't making clocks. They were having people make clocks for them and then marketing for them. This was James Bishop and Merritt Hemingway, who was a cousin of Maria Hemingway's father. James Bishop in Bishop and Bradley, again, mainly pillar and scrolls. Here's a Bishop and Bradley, Watertown, Connecticut maker. And we know William Hickcox could make the bases for pillar and scrolls, so it's absolutely predictable that he was making pillar and scroll cases in Watertown for various makers. Not sure that it was this maker, but he was certainly involved in that. Here we have a James Bishop case that came out of Watertown, and I only point this out. Now the splat doesn't go up, but look at the elongated upper columns and the flat turn columns at the base. It's got a movement by Samuel Terry, for what good that is, but I'm saying there are other Watertown cases with the characteristics that William Hickcox liked to throw into his clocks. Lucius Bradley made cases with Salem Bridge movements and also again with James Bishop and Bradley. Merritt Hemingway, we mentioned earlier. Sedgwick and Botsford, wooden movement clocks. R. Smith, wooden movement clocks in Watertown. So Hickcox was undoubtedly involved with a number of local makers. As I know, within a day's ride from Watertown were literally hundreds of suppliers and firms involved in the clockmaking industry. Right next door, in Plymouth alone, there were nearly 50 active firms, including Heave and Clark, Curtis and Clark, Ephraim Downs, the Terry firms, and Silas Hoadley. So here's a map of here's Litchfield County, Connecticut, and this is the town of Watertown in Litchfield County. And this is the village of Watertown, and this is the insert over here, and we'll be referring to a number of locations there with regard to property owned by Hickcox. So his first deed at Watertown was 1823. He was 27 years of age. One can presume that he was involved in the trade prior to that, making enough money to purchase his own property. Purchased a quarter-acre lot 100 yards eastwardly from the Episcopal Church. A lot of these deeds reference the church, so you end up trying to figure out what 100 rods is. A rod is the equivalent of 16 feet. So I tried to pay Mary Jane to stomp out 16 feet, but she wouldn't do it. So that's approximately 1,600 feet or 500 yards east of the Episcopal Church. So based on the description, I ended up right around here on this corner. It says, bounded north on Widow Judge land, east on Ebenezer's French's land, south and southwest by the highway. So I'm guessing that was his first, the location of his first property, which was a house lot. 2 months later, in November, he bought a half interest in a clock shop. Certain shop owned and undivided in common with his former partner, David Woodward, deceased. And here's the Episcopal Church just north, and there's the shop of David Woodward. A few rods west of the Presbyterian meeting house, blah, 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 blah. One half of the land on which the said shop stands, as well as one half of the shop. So that's his shop in 1823. He held on that property for 3 years, selling it back to the family in 1826. And the year prior, he married Maria Hemingway of New Haven, Connecticut, obviously a prominent family based on the inheritance she got. And indeed, the Hemingways of New Haven were related to Merritt Hemingway in Watertown. That may have been how the two met. As we mentioned, Merritt Hemingway and James Bishop were involved together in marketing clocks. And Hickcox House that we just described was actually adjacent to what became Merritt Hemingway's silk factory in Watertown. So this is a much later map, of course, 1850, so things have moved on, but that's the house location. And then in July 1825, right across the street, Hickcox purchased an acre and a half with dwelling house and barn west by the Litchfield Turnpike Road. This was the probable location of Hickcox's shop. Interestingly enough, he mortgaged the property from the Episcopal Church, to which he must have been a member. The Episcopal Church loaned him the money to buy his lot and house, and the subject to annual payments from 1826 to 1832, totaling $675. And this is what the neighborhood looked like in 1918 in a local map. And this is the corner on which Hickcox was located. And by 1918, a big mansion was here, and this had been developed. So I'm sure that it wasn't the same, but here's the church in relationship to the property. Hickox and Hoadley, finally, Pat's been waiting the entire talk. In October 1830, William Hickcox sold his house and shop lot to a guy named Silas Hoadley of Plymouth, reserving for Hickcox the privilege of living upon and occupying the premises until the said Hoadley shall have paid me $800 according to our contract in clocks. Hello. And Hickcox to have the privilege afterwards of renting the house until the first day of November 1831, in whole or in part at the option of said Hoadley. With whatever money he had, he paid off his mortgage to the Episcopal Society in July 1831, assuming he was at Watertown until late 1831. It's likely he relocated to North Bridgewater, New York within the next year. Hoadley held on to this property and shop until 1833 when it was sold for $1,500, which was a fairly pricey deal. I mentioned earlier that there was only one clock in the entire Good for a Time edition that had upturned columns, and interestingly enough, the flat-turned side columns. And I guess not surprisingly, that's a somewhat low-cost version, basic case made by Silas Hoadley in Plymouth, Connecticut. So I'm making that connection, whether you like it or not. And so in the meantime, over the years, I've saved copies of clocks that have some of the characteristics we've noticed of Hickcox-made cases, including elongated upper columns, upturned splats, and the other various column treatments. And here are some of the ones I found. Here's a Peck, Hayden & Company with a St. Louis label, Connecticut-made case marketed by Peck, Hayden and Company, way out in the Midwest. And again, that has lots of the characteristics we've been talking about. Here's an R. Smith Watertown, and this has all the characteristics we've been talking about: the upturned side splats, the elongated upper portion of the splats, the lower turn columns, in this case with paw feet. Here's an M&E Blakesley with the elongated upper columns, flat lower columns, and yes, little upturned side in a somewhat different splat. I mentioned the Hoadley cases in general that show up these characteristics. These columns with the flat turning on the top and bottom. This is a miniature time and alarm. Hoadley, he was the most prolific maker of that type of clock, and it would appear at least certainly possible that William Hickcox had some involvement with the making of these beautiful little timepiece cases as well. And then another version of the Hoadley lower price, higher volume cases that he made with the Terry type movements with some of the column transitional work. So after selling the property at Bridgewater, I tried to find out what happened to William and Maria. My guess is they probably went back to Litchfield County for a while, although I can't prove it. They didn't buy any property when they were there. I finally tracked them down in 1860, so we just lost about 20 years of their history. 1860, William is 63 years old. He has two children, daughters Anna and Elizabeth, living in the New Lot section of Brooklyn, New York, also referred to as East New York. William is listed as a tin and stove dealer. Real estate valued at $3,500, personal estate at $500, and he's in the business directories. They list their house and business at 25 Fulton Avenue. Anna and Elizabeth are both listed as having been born in New York State, and assuming that was Bridgewater, the oldest child would have been born in 1832, which fits the timeline. So what did East New York look like? Nothing like it looks like today. Couple interesting things. So this is the New Lots section. This map is from 1859, if I can read that correctly. And notice how few buildings there were in Brooklyn, New York, in this section of Brooklyn, New York. Here's Fulton Avenue. So his house was located somewhere along Fulton Avenue. On this map, it shows Horse Railroad. So these were commuter railroad cars pulled by horses that ended up in a terminal here in this section of Brooklyn. And if you look on Google Maps today, the satellite view, there's a giant subway repair shop here. So there's a whole yard full of hundreds of subway cars. And I'm sure there's people out removing graffiti from them even as we speak. And notice this railroad line going through here. This section of Brooklyn now, the railroad's not there because it's underground. It's been put into a tunnel, but this is the Long Island Railroad going out to Long Island, and I'm sure there's not much left of any of these original buildings where William Hickcox ended up. The 1880 census continues to list him as a tinsmith. His wife Maria, his daughter Anna, maybe a grandson, an Irish apprentice named Samuel Miller, and a young lady. He died on December 22nd, 1882, 86 years old, buried at New Lots. Interestingly, his daughter Anna, who apparently never married, is listed in the Brooklyn City directories as a tinsmith, taking over his operation after his death at 25 Fulton Street. And Maria died, his wife died in 1892 and was buried at in the Evergreen Cemetery, the family plot, her parents' family plot in New Haven, Connecticut. And that is it. Questions by anybody? Yes, sir.
What restoration has been done to the clock cases?
To the dials themselves?
Right, and to the wooden cases
Okay, so nothing has been done to the dials. Chris Brown claimed that on the giant pillar and scroll, I don't know any better way to describe that clock, he claimed, and with Chris, you could almost believe his claims. He claimed that well, I know he bought that from Doug Wright, and he claimed that it was, I did see it. The finish was black on the clock. You could not tell that the ball finials were maple, etc. He claimed that he stripped that finish off with a razor blade.
Oh, gee, really?
Well, that's what he claimed.
Wow.
The clock on the left, I restored. I'll confess, I restored. When I got it again, it was so black you could not tell. I was very surprised when those nice little maple caps and bases came out. This clock was in Catone's auction and is exactly like that. And I don't believe it's had much of anything in the way of restoration. Sir.
Notice some of these have finials and some don't.
Mm-hmm.
Any pattern to that?
Most don't. The majority of the shelf clocks that I've seen over the years, others can comment, that have finials typically carved, like pineapple finials, are those that have carved columns as well. It's an extra feature, it's extra work. They fall off, they get in the way of shipping. So I don't know whether it was a fashion issue that people just weren't excited, that didn't make any difference, whether they had finials or not, is whether they would purchase a clock. It may not have been as fashionable as the prior era with the pillar and scrolls where finials were expected, but so we can say that most of them did not, for whatever reason.
I have an Ephraim Downs that had carved columns
Mm-hmm.
and
Carved finials, yeah, right, yes.
Any commonality between the reverse painting or the mirrors that you see across the board? Yes, for Wilcox?
He absolutely liked to have reverse paintings in the transitional cases. I'm going to say I think all of the ones that I've seen either had original or replaced reverse tablets in those, and the total opposite is true of the other shelf clock styles that I've seen. They all have mirrors. Yep.
Is there a chance that the one on the left ever had feet, or that others like that had feet and they broke and got into the other style?
There's no sign whatsoever that the other ones had scroll bases.
That you'd see shadows?
Yeah, and I think all of the half column and splats I've shown are in my clock room, so none of those did. So I can attest to having looked at the bases. No glue marks, no anything. So one of the ones I showed in the Connecticut auction that I saw, that was just a picture I had. I would love to flip that baby over because everything else was there except for the base. And as you know, those bases come off every once in a while. So I'm sure they could have been sold both ways, but that one would have been one you might want to have flipped over to see if there was any evidence on the bottom. Anything else? You've been a very nice crowd. A few of you fell asleep, which I appreciate. So thanks so much. All right, back to Pat. Thank you.